In the Lord of the Rings book, there is a small but very fascinating detail which also did not make it into the Peter Jackson films. But I, Gandalf, rode to the foot of Orthanc and came to the stair of Saruman, and there he met me and led me up to his high chamber. He wore a ring on his finger. And a few lines later, Saruman also introduces himself as, "And here you will stay, Gandalf the Grey, and rest from your journeys, for I am Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ringmaker, Saruman of many colors." This clearly indicates that the White Wizard made a ring for himself and, as a result, sees himself as Ringmaker now, which is a term that also refers to Sauron one time in the Lord of the Rings book. Beyond that, there's only one indirect mention in the foreword of the Lord of the Rings. Even if we look into Tolkien's early writing process of Lord of the Rings, documented in some of the History of Middle-earth books, we only learn that the mention of this ring appears first in the fourth iteration from the 1940s of the Council of Elrond chapter we find in the Treason of Isengard book, which is also the first time where we at all find Gandalf's tale of his captivity in Isengard that he tells during the council. Interestingly, in this early iteration, Saruman only said, "For I am Saruman, Saruman the Wise, Saruman of many colors." The Ringmaker was not in that line yet. Unfortunately, there are no further notes on this edition. With so few sources, Saruman's ring is a detail that we can only speculate about, so this video is more on the interpretation and speculation side of things. My name is Chris, aka ThePhilosophersGames, and today we discuss Saruman's ring. Shoutouts to the artists that allowed me to use their fantastic artworks like Kimberly80, Ted Naismith, Firat Solhan, and all the others. Links to their galleries are in the description. Also, don't forget about the YouTube things. Our next clue we find in the mentioned foreword, where Tolkien hints at the differences between legendary war and real war. He states that in real war the ring would have been used as weapon against the enemy, but the war he describes is that of legend or mythology. He interestingly makes a point about Saruman in this argument that gives us an interesting piece of information. Saruman, failing to get possession of the ring, would, in the confusion and treacheries of the time, have found in Mordor the missing links in his own research into ring lore, and before long he would have made a great ring of his own with which to challenge the self-styled ruler of Middle-earth. This, though, never happened, so it implies that those missing links were still there during the creation of Saruman's ring, and that it cannot be equal to a great ring of power. However, great ring, to challenge the self-styled ruler of Middle-earth, can here also be interpreted as an equivalent to the One Ring, which is also one of the great rings of power. In this case, his ring could have been already comparable to one of the great rings of power besides the One Ring. This is not fully clear. Another detail we get from this and what we know about Saruman in Lord of the Rings is that the White Wizard definitely wanted to create a ring of power for himself, or an equivalent to them, maybe with his own design in mind. As we learned in my 10+ hour Who is Elrond lore video, or in part 12 of it, link is in the description, Saruman betrayed everyone. The Valar, the Istari, the White Council, the Elves, Rohan, Gondor, Sauron, and probably also himself. In his origin, he is like the other Istari, or wizards, Sauron and the Balrog, one of the Ainur, powerful spirit beings comparable to angels, and one of the Maiar, to be precise, so of lower rank, serving those Ainur of higher rank, the Valar. Saruman, like Sauron, was a Maiar of the Valar Aule, the blacksmith of the Valar. As a result, it can be assumed that both had vast knowledge about creating artifacts. Further, we know from Gandalf, the lore of the elven rings, great and small, is his province. He has long studied it, seeking the lost secrets of their making. We can read in many texts that Saruman researched the lore of the rings extensively and at some point also started to search for the One Ring himself. ever since the elven lord Círdan gave his ring of power Narya to Gandalf. Saruman begrudged it, quote, "And the grey messenger took the ring and kept it ever secret. Yet the white messenger, who was skilled to uncover all secrets, after a time became aware of this gift and begrudged it, and it was the beginning of the hidden ill will that he bore to the grey, which afterwards became manifest." Further, we need to understand what the great rings of power actually do. Their main purpose from the perspective of the elves was slowing or stopping the decay of the world. Quote, "The chief power of all rings alike was the prevention or slowing of decay. It est change viewed as a regrettable thing." This was potentially different for the One Ring. Sauron made one ring the ruling ring that contained the powers of all the others and controlled them so that its wearer could see the thoughts of all those that used the lesser rings, could govern all that they did, and in the end could utterly enslave them. So the One Ring's main purpose was the control of the other rings. However, all the rings also had the ability to enhance the powers of its wearer. Quote, "But also they enhanced the natural powers of a possessor, thus approaching magic, a motif easily corruptible into evil, a lust for domination. Even the One Ring did this. While he wore it, Sauron the One Ring, his power on earth was actually enhanced, but even if he did not wear it, that power existed and was enwrapped with himself. He was not diminished. So the One Ring also enhanced the power of Sauron. What Saruman now wanted with the One Ring is basically described in the next sentences of this text, which we find in letter 131. "Unless some others seized it and became possessed of it. If that happened, the new possessor could, if sufficiently strong and heroic by nature, challenge Sauron, become master of all that he had learned or done since the making of the One Ring, and so overthrow him and usurp his place. In Saruman's pride, arrogance, and hubris, a dangerous combination, he thought he could accomplish this, but since he could not get the One Ring, nor one of the other great rings of power, he must have then started creating his own ring. All the time he lived in Middle-earth, he saw how Sauron's ring so heavily influenced the history of the continent and its people. He lacked the vision and, I guess, the creativity of Sauron, though, so all he could do was imitating him. The tower, the orcs, and Uruk-hai in the book Sauron also used Uruk-hai, the desire to bring his own vision of order over Middle-earth, and the ring. It's all very similar. He could not envision something else, and he had not the ability, maybe nor the will, to sacrifice so much of himself to create his own One Ring. He also knew that the other rings of power were slaves to the One, so he could not have wanted to recreate one of those. He wanted to replace Sauron, not become a slave. As a result, Saruman's design of a ring needed to be free from Sauron's influence and original ideas, and as he clearly had not the same or more power compared to Sauron, he needed something to increase his power fast, a shortcut to power, skipping natural growth, harmony with the world, meticulous craftsmanship and labor. That was all too slow. He needed a magic device that made him instantly more powerful than Sauron, else the Dark Lord would win from his perspective. This is to some degree the philosophical concept Tolkien called the machine. The One Ring was the ultimate representation of this concept, and Saruman needed it or another. We all know the great rings of power enhanced the natural powers of a possessor. They increased the lifespan of mortals as well, and all except the three were able to render invisible the material body and making things of the invisible world visible. They also stopped or slowed the decay. Saruman was a spirit being in nature. He did not really need to render invisible the material body to see the unseen. He also did not want to stop the decay, because he wanted to decay or change the world in a regrettable way himself. He was in addition already immortal, so these powers were of little use to him. Only enhancing his power would have helped him, so one could assume that this was the desired purpose of his ring, if it had any power at all. It must also be mentioned that power itself is a very vague term already. Since Tolkien does not mention the ring anywhere again, and it is also never again a concern of Gandalf or Frodo later in the Shire, there is very little reason to assume it had any significant power. Maybe he made it to impress Gandalf and to show him what he would become, which Gandalf of course did not like. Maybe it was like one of the lesser rings, which were only essays in the craft before it was full grown, and to the elven smiths they were but trifles, yet still, to Gandalf's mind, dangerous for mortals, though the text hints at them being potentially dangerous, so a concern for sure, which the Grey Wizard never addressed about Saruman's ring. In the confrontation with Saruman, Gandalf was mainly concerned over his staff, the keys of Orthanc and the Palantir, but not his ring, though he definitely has seen it because his words are the only source for it. Would the ring have made Saruman's voice even more dangerous, in the sense of more convincing? It definitely would have been a concern. Tolkien writes about Saruman's voice. Saruman's voice was not hypnotic but persuasive. Those who listened to him were not in danger of falling into a trance, but of agreeing with his arguments while fully awake. It was always open to one to object by free will and reason, both his voice while speaking and its after impressions. Saruman corrupted the reasoning powers. And mostly they remembered only that it was a delight to hear the voice speaking. All that it said seemed wise and reasonable, and desire awoke in them by swift agreement to seem wise themselves. It also had a magical component for sure. For many, the sound of the voice alone was enough to hold them enthralled, but for those whom it conquered, the spell endured when they were far away, and ever they heard that soft voice whispering and urging them. But none were unmoved, none rejected its pleas and its commands without an effort of mind and will, so long as its master had control of it. So a ring that in some way increased this ability further would have been without a doubt a big concern for the remaining wise. Also, I'm not sure that enhancing the power of his voice was even needed for Saruman. He was already powerful enough to potentially convince the people he needed to convince. In the case of convincing the Witch King and sending him on a wrong way in one text published in Unfinished Tales, he must have already possessed his ring while doing so. Some interpret this as a sign that this ring helped him to achieve this. But Tolkien later wrote another version of that situation called version C, where the magical voice part that came out of the gate was toned down, potentially removed, and a simple lie was sufficient. We can read this skillful speech convinced even the Witch King for the moment. But that sounds far less magical than, therefore, to his challenge and demands, he, the Witch King, received only the answer of the voice of Saruman that spoke by some art as though it came from the gate itself. If we combine these arguments, I think it is very unlikely that Tolkien thought of the ring as a powerful artifact, making Saruman's voice even more powerful. It's of course hard to say what power Saruman needed to be enhanced. Bigger armies, powerful servants that could rival the Nazgul, better intel on his enemies, better equipment for his armies, stronger soldiers, better strategies. Those were the needs of Saruman, I think. Convincing men like the Dunelandings to fight on his side was also important, but I think he was able to convince them without too much trouble anyway, without additional potency in his voice. They hated Rohan and Gondor anyway. So while I think that the idea of his ring enhancing his abilities, like his voice, is a cool theory, I see it looking into the books as quite unlikely. The powers were already with Saruman, and he was able to become a threat for sure. But to overthrow Sauron, he needed far more. Even though the plan to enslave the elves of Eregion failed at the end, Sauron was able to form a new plan and enslave some mighty men who should become his most powerful servants. That was something Saruman lacked completely. His most powerful servant was maybe Grima Wormtongue, who possessed a lot of influence over Rohan, but he lost this position, and then the wizard continued to diminish him by treating him poorly and not giving him any new tasks and making him more powerful. Us fans often speculate that Sauron could make these rings because he was once a servant of Aule, the smith of the Valar, but what the One Ring did was very evil, so a power that most likely originated from Sauron's former master Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, that he in a way succeeded, not from Aule. We can read, "It was this Morgoth element in matter indeed, which was a prerequisite for such magic and other evils as Sauron practiced with it and upon it." Morgoth damaged and corrupted a lot of the matter of the world itself by putting his power into it, like the world itself became his One Ring. That is also the origin of the mentioned decay. And Sauron still used this power for his evils even at the end of the Third Age, long after Morgoth was banned into the void. As a former servant of Morgoth, he for sure learned a lot from him, but that was completely different for Saruman. In addition, Saruman, as an Istar, was also diminished while on Middle-earth. There is also no information of when the White Wizard's Ring was created. There's only one hint you could interpret a bit. Gandalf met Radagast on his way south of Bree. The Brown Wizard tells him about the Nazgul. In this dialogue we find a small hint. "Who told you and who sent you?" I asked. "Saruman the White," answered Radagast. So when Radagast last met Saruman, he was still Saruman the White, not of many colors. He does not mention a strange change or anything. If we assume that this change and the creation of his ring happened around the same time, then we know that the ring can't be that old at Mid-Year's Day, Third Age 3018. Though maybe Radagast didn't notice, because also Gandalf did not notice it directly. Saruman in this time definitely decided to betray Gandalf and break his role, being the White, and become Saruman of many colors, Saruman, Ringmaker. There was no way back from that point on, and I think the ring symbolizes this new step in his life, same with his new robes, then creating an actual equivalent to a ring of power. You have to also keep in mind, creating a ring of power took decades or almost a century. It took Sauron 100 years from leaving Eregion and making the One Ring. So in the end, the answer is sadly quite boring. The ring could not possess significant powers and maybe even had none, else it would have been a topic in the book and a concern of the wise. Saruman was imitating Sauron, and so his ring was also just an imitation, like in a child's fantasy mimicking their idol. Maybe he saw it as placeholder for the One Ring should he be able to convince Gandalf to ally with him. Maybe it was really one of his first attempts creating something distantly similar to a ring of power, but without any significant might yet. We will never know, but it's fun speculating about it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe, press the like button and maybe leave a comment. What are your theories regarding Saruman's ring? Did I forget anything? Are there additional quotes I overlooked? Also, maybe check out my other lore videos and gaming related videos. I already mentioned my over 10-hour long Who is Elrond video, which also exists in 13 parts, also started uploading it to Spotify. Huge shoutouts and thank you to all my supporters who support on all kinds of platforms like Patreon, Ko-fi, with YouTube memberships, Twitch subscriptions and so on. Much appreciated. There will also be a new lore Q&A stream soon, I think. Again, thank you for watching and goodbye.